All right, this is part 2 of understanding cybersecurity frameworks, and this is part of the CISSP supplement that we add as part of our broadcast/podcasts that occur on a weekly basis, along with individual training that I provide through Reduce Cyber Risk. All right, let's get started. So as we're looking at a case study, this is called the Cybersecurity Framework, and we had talked about in part 1 around PCI-DSS and the aspects that how it works within the governance and compliance piece of that. Well, so now we're going to pull up a framework that came out back in April of 2018, and it's called the Cybersecurity Framework. And what it's designed to do is it's a voluntary framework with potentially with standards, guidelines, and best practices on what you should do to protect your environment. Now, it's designed specifically to manage your cybersecurity risk in a cost-effective manner. And it was put together in a way that originally it came from the critical infrastructure framework that is used within the nuclear energy regulation compliance. No, it's actually NERC, is Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission. I think that's what it is. But it came from the critical infrastructure framework. And so they morphed it, made some changes to it, and they called it the Cybersecurity Framework. And this comes from NIST, National Institutes of Standards and Technology. It was published in 2018, in April of 2018, and it's really designed around the security framework or around the critical infrastructure. However, it works really well with different types of security mechanisms, and it's a really good product to help a business that is going to be implementing some level of security framework within their organization. The part I like about it is because it's very simple. It gets right to the point. It's not complicated, and it makes a lot of sense. However, if you don't understand, if you haven't really done with the framework before, it can look a little daunting, a little challenging. However, there's a lot of really good information out there on that. At Reduce Cyber Risk, we're actually going to go over some frameworks here in the future and how you can actually fill those out and work best for you, step by step, and what are some key aspects you need to be aware of as you fill one out. It is version 1.1, but version 1.0 is still viable, and but they've made some slight changes to it that took it to the next version. Now, the background around this is that Executive Order 13636, okay, came into being, and that was about basically improving the critical infrastructure of cybersecurity. And the purpose of it was that they knew that they had issues. There's electrical grids have been hacked. There's other areas of that water supplies that have been hacked, and so they thought they needed to put some level of standardization around these environments, and hence that's the reason for the cybersecurity framework. The cool part about all this, though, is that anybody can use it and they can implement it within their organization, and it's not real hard to do. And what it started off was a collaboration between industry and government on what the best way to secure their environment, from identity to detecting to mitigating these risks and so forth. And it created a set of standards, guidelines, and practices basically to promote the protection of critical infrastructure. But in reality, you can use it anywhere. It doesn't have to be just specifically an electrical power grid or on a water treatment facility. So what it can do for you. Now, what it does is it provides clarity. Okay, that's what it can do, and direction around what may seem very daunting and confusing, honestly. So it provides that for you. And it can reduce the premiums associated with cyber insurance. Now, I've looked at different cyber insurance policies. One of the big aspects that comes into this is having a framework in place. I think it's Ohio came up with a part of a cybersecurity legislation that basically states that if you follow a cybersecurity law or a framework of some kind, then what ends up happening is the ability for someone to sue you is dramatically reduced. And I think they called it a safe harbor, but bottom line is they're saying that if you do follow a framework, you implement practices in place to protect yourself, they can't sue you from a civil standpoint. Now, whether or not that actually happens or not, it's hard to say, but at the end of the day, it can reduce your risk as it relates to your litigation situation. But it also, in the case of a cybersecurity insurance, they will ask you, do you follow some level of a framework for your company and for your business? And so therefore, they're looking to ways to reduce their risk. They know that if you're following a framework and you have it documented and you have people that are working on it, odds are strong that you've been paying attention, and therefore you will put practices in place to limit the risk to your organization. So again, these can reduce the premiums associated with cyber insurance. Again, I'm not a lawyer and I'm an insurance agent, and but we have seen it in the past, and I've dealt with it individually that it can happen. So something to consider. It can be a factor in a civil lawsuit. Again, I come back to the fact I'm not a lawyer, okay? But having a solid security program in place has been noted, and we talked about this just recently with Ohio, but it's been noted that if you have this when it comes to data breach, you are in a much better position. We talked about earlier Massachusetts and their security laws that are in place, their data breach notification laws. And a part of this is that you have a documented security program. Well, if you have a framework in place, then that will help you with your security program, and it'll allow you to have it be documented as well. So there's a lot of good positives around this as what it can do for you. Now, what it cannot do for you, it's not a checklist on what to implement. Now, it may seem a little bit prescriptive as we look at this here in the future. It may come across like, well, if I just do this check, if I do this check, but you're going to have to take a risk-based approach on what you put into place and what you don't put into place. And it can't just be a checklist, because what's going to happen is you're going to do that. You're going to put this checklist in place, but you don't put any controls around it. And if something bad happens, well, they're going to come after you. So it's not just, I'm going to go check these boxes and then move on. It is something you're going to have to follow through with. Now, it's not all-encompassing, right, with all regulations. Some of these regulations are still changing, and it will not meet all of the regulations around it. So as an example, HITRUST has different regulations than ISO 27001 certifications do. They're not the same. One's in the health industry, one is not necessarily the health industry. Now, could you use one as more of a broad brush? You could. However, you may actually end up adding a lot of extra waste because you have to put all these things in place. So it's just something to consider. Do you really need it? But know that if you're using the cybersecurity framework, it will get you in a good spot that will meet a majority of these other frameworks as well, the HITRUSTs, the ISO 27001, and so forth. It'll go a long ways to put you in a good position. Now, it's not an easy button that you just mash and you move on. So I hit this button, I'm good to go now that I have a framework in place. No, you actually have to do the hard work and heavy lifting and put something in place on paper and document it. So again, it's just not this easy button that hey, I've got this piece of paper. Aha, I'm protected. It's like a bulletproof jacket or something. No, it's not. It'll go right through. The bullet will go right through. So you need to make sure that you do have something in place there. Now, it will provide you guidance without IT, and what it basically means is that you can look through it and go, okay, yeah, I did that. Yeah, I did that. But the problem is if you don't have IT support on this, you could be setting yourself up. And so the point of that is that IT, as your subject matter experts, need to be involved with you. They need to know what you're putting in place, why you're putting in place, and what you're going to do to make sure it's mitigated. Now, they may do the mitigation pieces for you, but at the end of it, they're the ones that have to be involved with you as far as it's being orchestrated and put within your environment. It's also not a liability shield, not by any stretch of the imagination. We've talked about this in the past, but it will help reduce your risk around liability, but it's not like, okay, I did it. You can't touch me. No, that's not the truth. It can touch you big time, but it's just something to prove that in the event something bad does happen, you have gone through the steps you needed to best protect your information, your customer's information, and potentially, depending upon where it's at, your company's information. So you really need to just make sure that you go through it and you follow it and you understand what exactly you're doing. So now, what is a mapping? So framework mapping, this is various regulatory frameworks and standards that are global. And what it does is it maps against those. So if you consider the HITRUST we talked about earlier, or COBIT, or any of these other frameworks that are out there, the big five. So what's going to happen is you're going to say, well, cybersecurity framework, you do A, B, and C. Well, A, B, and C will map, which will match up pretty well with B, F, and G on the HITRUST. Or it may work on A, B, and F on COBIT, right? So the point of it is that it's going to map. How do they all tie together? Now, you'd be nice to say, if I do one, it covers them all. The problem is each of them have different needs. So if you did that, it would be monstrously huge and it would be hard to maintain. So again, you have to decide how you want to handle that. Now, Others have cybersecurity as a category. We talked about regulations, and they're designed specifically for cybersecurity. Some frameworks are, like cybersecurity, the CSSP-SUP, Cybersecurity Framework. But others are using it as a category, and we talked about high trust as an example. Cybersecurity is just a piece of it, but it's an aspect. Same with COBIT and so forth. Now, they cover various items based on the location and the industry, and that really depends upon the situation where you're at. So you got one of them is called an information security management system, or you've got another one's framework for policies and procedures, or it includes legal and physical and technical controls. Okay, all of these different things that are in place will vary from location and will vary in industry. Now, so as an example, from a framework mapping standpoint, you have ISO 27001:2013. Okay, so then you have NIST 853. Then you have AICPA, which is the based around CPAs. There's SOC, okay, for cybersecurity. You have HIPAA. You have Chinese cyber law. All of these together will map to different things. I've looked at the Chinese cyber law in depth, and there are pieces of that fit in very, very well with 853. And 853 will fit in good with the cybersecurity framework. It's pretty close on that. 20,000 or 27,001 is a lot more in depth, and because of it's a certification, it's really more of a challenge. However, if you were to go and say, you know what, there's no requirement that says I have to do ISO 27001. They're recommending that I do ISO 27001. But you say, you know what, I've been working on 853, NIST 853's security mapping forever, right? We just moved to 27,001. Well, if you do that and you try to map those together, you're going to be 80 to 90% there. So it's just something you need to consider as it relates to the different pieces around the frameworks. But again, they all have a different spin on it, but identity is identity. And you just have to find out how deep into the identity and access management you have to go. So with the cybersecurity framework, there's the ID-AM-I. Okay, so what this is it's in the identity aspect, okay, and it's around physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. Now, that's what it states. So that's what this piece of the cybersecurity framework states, ID-AM-1 or -I. HIPAA Security Rule 45 CFR, okay, talks about the fact that you have to have a privacy aspects around individual identifiable health information. Okay, now that will happen also in the cybersecurity framework, but it won't be specifically to that wording. There's also a security rule, which is the security standards for protection of electronic protected health information. Okay, so the same things that are in there will match up with the ID-AM-I or 1, whatever that is. And the point of that is that there are going to be pieces of it that will coalesce or connect together. So that would be the security rules or the privacy rules would all tie into the ID-AM-1. So also in the ID-AM-1, you have we talked about that briefly. There's AICPA, which is Trust Services Criteria, which basically is the SOC for cybersecurity. And you're probably going, what the heck is that? Well, these CPAs, what is a CPA? Accounting, right? It's accountant, right? I can't think of what the CPA stands for, but it's CPAs. And so bottom line is you have the things that are decided in there. And one example is an entity identifies the risk of achievement of its objectives across the entity and analyzes risk as a basis for determining how risks should be managed. They use risks a lot in there, and they use identity a lot in there. However, identity ties into the ID-AM-1. And so therefore they use that as a way to map against it. If you're assessing the criticality of those information systems or identifying threats, all of that is tied into the cybersecurity framework as well. Now, it isn't worded the same. They're very differently worded, but you have to understand that there are mapping products out there that will map you to what exactly the cybersecurity framework maps to as it relates to the AICPA Trust Services Criteria, or SOC for cybersecurity. All right, so here's some of the references that we put together for this part 2 of understanding cybersecurity frameworks. It's IT governance, the NIST cybersecurity framework, Calipix security, Tenables trends in security framework and adoption surveys, PCI security standards, and interactive application security testing. All right. Hope you like what you saw, and we'll just get back to this, and you'll have some more. We'll catch you on the flip side. See you next week. Thank you. Bye.